The objective of war is to destroy your enemy's ability to fight and make him surrender, to destroy his infrastructure, his armies, and the battlefield. The Second World War was one of the most destructive conflicts man have ever known, and it saw the beginning of the nuclear age, the use of guided missiles and rockets. The base technology that was not entirely new to the 1940s, but all held their roots in the post-World War I development. It was developed by some of Germany's brightest high-speed, low-drag scientists and military engineers, still covered by a veil of secrecy which remains until today, where the true scope of much of what was done is still classified or unknown. So if you suspect that your government, the media, the powers that be, are lying to you, I can promise you they are, and they have been for a very long time. And only if we begin to unravel the historical past can we begin to understand how deep the roots go. From the time that Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in the 1930s, Germany seemed to hold all the cards. They had the best scientists, the best know-how, the most advanced nuclear projects. They had the great rocket scientists in the making. And throughout the war, yet an untold amount of funding and research was thrown at perfecting and developing these. Yet we have been led to believe that Germany somehow dropped the ball, and America beat them to it. Mainstream history was established already in 1944 by the American Alsos teams, who declared that German nuclear programs were far behind and of no threat. Reports, history books, and documentaries have since been produced to support that thesis. That narrative was thus created, and it is most likely wrong. I have studied and written military history all my life, and time after time I've come across statements, documents, research sites that just did not fit into this narrative. So I wanted to know more, and for the past several years I have been flying against this convention, so I traveled to all the special sites, wanting to see them for myself, to judge what was possible, and by following the documents and statements about the locations where very secret German research took place throughout the war. I have visited many places the Alsos teams never saw, and leads into tunnels deep in the east where huge complexes remain from the wartime, yet not with a single document. I have banged on every national archive only to find nothing, or that documents are still classified after 75, 80 years. Along with a steady stream of intelligence connections and vanishing SS generals and officers, that only raises more questions. My name is Tino Struckmann. I'm a military historian. I'm a veteran. I'm stubborn, and I want to know what happened. This was a war about technology, ideology, and millions of people died. Thousands died just to protect and create this very technology, and we owe it to them to discover and tell the truth of what really happened for the sake of history. By now, most people have come to accept that Werner Heisenberg's nuclear project, the one found by the Alsos troops in Heikelok, as the one prominent German nuclear project. He was well known, so naturally the Allies assumed he was the only real contender, and if he failed the German program, it must have failed as well, right? Wrong. However, towards the end of the war, Germany had over 11 separate nuclear programs, and they were by no means unified under one command. There was a lot of different projects run by a lot of very different and very talented scientists. In 1942, apparently, Adolf Hitler gave an order that the nuclear bomb research should end, since in his opinion it would not come to any fruition before the end of the war. However, throughout the war, Hitler was continuously updated on advances made by these various programs. So the nuclear bomb project still took place despite this order. And the SS, on instruction by Heinrich Himmler, continued to draft thousands of skilled technicians from the front for the SS nuclear project. In the middle of the German armaments industrial complex at Oranienburg lay the factory Auerwerke. It produced uranium oxide, amongst other things. It was founded by Auer von Welsbach in 1885 and had from then produced various radioactive products, including that of extracting thorium oxide after Otto Hahn's discovery. From 1934, the company belonged to Degussa AG Frankfurt with over 10,000 employees in the armaments industry. Otto Hahn discovered nuclear fission in 1938. Before the war, all research institutes were reunified under Nicholas Rehl, who, along with Otto Hahn, they both understood the importance of the nuclear discovery, both economic and militarily. In the spring of 1939, they met with the Army Research Office to discuss the feasibility of the practical use of nuclear fission. The Army requested that Auerwerke provide several tons of uranium compounds from their stocks. They in turn immediately built a production plant to produce uranium oxide for the Army's testing. By 1940, the first 240 grams of high pure uranium metal was delivered. In 1945, when the facility fell to the Russians, 330 tons of uranium materials and 7 tons of metallic uranium was found. This was the materials the Russians used to start their first reactor in 1946. Both Nicholas Rehl and Manfred von Ardenne, along with other German scientists, were brought to Russia to accomplish this. It is safe to say that the Russian nuclear program leading to their bomb development was founded by German materials, uranium, and scientists. Post-war speculations have now begun to surface that the U.S. nuclear bomb project also benefited at a greater extent than previously believed from German research, blueprints, and materials of which we now know there were a lot more than we have been led to believe. Now not far from where von Braun tested his first rockets at the Army test range at Kummersdorf. On this property, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, working along with the Army Research Center, built the first nuclear reactor at Gottow. The program was run by Erich Schumann, chief of the Heereswaffenamt and an explosives expert, and Kurt Diebner, nuclear scientist. They were both party men, and they were looking for a self-sustaining nuclear reaction, but on the fourth trial test it began to run away from them, and they had to halt the experiment, but certainly not the program. They were both looking for a bomb. After talking about it for so many years, then here it finally is. And it's so small, relatively speaking.
The strange thing is there's no radiation. It's only outside on this side.
I mean, there would have been a false floor because
I think here was floor, then wooden house was here.
Yeah.
And here in this concrete.
It's just amazing. It's so small, and the walls are so thin, and it was still a nuclear reactor.
Das war mit, ich glaube, mit schwerem Wasser gefüllt. Das ist die Frontseite. Da war eine kleine Bahn.
So, das war Teil von die Originale gebaut, ne? Ja, das habe ich, diesen eine Bild. Ja, das ist ein schwarz-weiß Bild auf die Seite.
Aber guck mal, du siehst den Zustand von dieser Wand hier, ne?
Ja.
Ist gut. So, deutscher Beton geht eigentlich nicht kaputt. Und diese Beschädigung hier, da gibt es Gerüchte, dass das mit dieser Schmelze zu tun hat.
Aha. So von die Hitze.
Ja, also durch die Hitze ist der Beton geschädigt worden.
Aber die Kran hast die ganze Reaktor hier gestellt.
Genau, der hat sie hier hingestellt. Hier stand das drin.
Träger
hier ist der vom Kran, ja.
So that's where the crane. This is where the crane was.
Yeah, the pole from the crane and
the fundament.
Crane goes inside the house.
Wow. So they put the reactor core right there. Do you think, because that was hot and melting, that has something to do with the destruction of the...
The historians say that.
But of course all the papers are in Moscow. Honestly, this is the first time after having talked about Diebner's reactor core for so long that I actually get to see it. And as you can tell, it is a very, very small building. You gotta think about it, this was a nuclear reactor, and when you go to a nuclear reactor today, this is not what you expect to see. It is a small, square, barely reinforced building. Level above ground, up here. So they put it down here, they put it down over there.
Okay,
What do you got?
what we can do here is some gamma spectroscopy. This is a Berkeley Nucleonics SAM 935, and to show you, these are refined uranium pieces in the soil here. Thorium, protactinium, another uranium, thorium, radium, and so on. And the final element is lead 206.
We can use
In Gotto. Never thought this is what I would be doing. But here we are, inside the core of the first reactor. It's kind of cool in here. And my Geiger counter's on, is not going off, which is more interesting. Diebner was conducting his tests far from here, near Jonastal in fact, and most of the papers pertaining to the German test program are still classified. But clearly the Germans had far more fissionable material than what was alluded to by the Alsos teams. And a further note is that in 1944, two British scientists, the head of the Manhattan Project, noted that the main goal of the atomic bomb project was not to keep the Germans from getting it, but to keep the Russians from getting it. Seems much more likely that a deal could be done with German scientists and with Dr. Kammler. Werner Heisenberg was, indeed, one of the most prominent physicists of the 20th century. And everybody knew him, and they knew his research, so it makes sense that his nuclear project would remain fairly public. It was funded by Hermann Göring, but it was not well funded. In fact, it was extremely underfunded. Now that led me to believe there was a much larger, much better funded, far more secret project hiding out there somewhere, like the far better funded program under Kurt Diebner and the Heereswaffenamt. And it must be noted that Heisenberg was not on good terms with Himmler or the SS, nor did they trust him, so leaving him in charge of a key program like this seemed unlikely. Now have no doubt that Germany was producing more than enough nuclear material, and Germany had control over vast stockpiles of uranium, verified simply by what was recovered by the Allies in 1945. Materials which was to become part of the American Manhattan Program, which had a sudden infusion of uranium just around 1945, making it possible to actually make the 3 bombs needed for testing and deployments. This is well documented in Carter Heydrich's book. However, my favorite German nuclear weapons program was run by the German Postal Service, the Reichspost, under extremely well-talented researcher Manfred von Ardenne, who must be mentioned that he had an extremely huge and well-funded lab in Berlin. It was partially funded by the German Postal Service, which was itself a very well-funded entity, who dealt in much more than just delivering mail. Hitler also personally visited von Ardenne's lab on several occasions, and when von Ardenne died, it was with over 600 patents to his name. Incidentally, after the war, he ran the Russian nuclear bomb project and developed their atomic bomb. He even received the Order of Lenin for his service. His lab still exists today. Now, certainly Ardenne knew what he was doing, and during the war, he was working on electromagnetic isotope separation. He was looking for a shortcut, trying to make fissionable material that could be used in a bomb. He was also the first one to make the correct calculations for critical mass of U-235. However, the name which is missing, and often left out of mainstream history, is Kurt Diebner. He was a specialist in hollow charges, one thing that might be important for searching for alternative ways of building a nuclear bomb. He ran the first functioning nuclear reactor at Gotha, and he was so good that even Heisenberg admitted it later and adopted his method. He and his boss at the Army's Research Institute, Erich Schumann, who was the head of the German Institute of Physics and Explosives, together they led another German nuclear weapons research program. And Kurt Diebner wanted to go straight from testing into practice. They wanted to build a bomb. They were both party members, which meant that they had the trust of the SS. Another reason why they might not be heard of much today, since the powers that be could not possibly give that sort of people any credit. Or could it be that their research actually came to fruition and was packed away or handed over to the US along with rocket research? It seems there's so much evidence now that the Germans had a bomb of mass destruction, whether it be plutonium or a small nuclear device. Even Von Ardenne, he said that he had made a small weapon of mass destruction that weighs between 1 and 3 kilograms. And you cannot say that Von Ardenne doesn't know what he's doing. He built nuclear bombs for the Russians, and he has an incredible track record. There's a lot of these German scientists that has Nobel Prizes and whatever else prizes they have. They're all incredibly intelligent people that before World War II really were far, far ahead of the game when it came to weapons and technological and science development. So certainly I think there's every reason to think they did something. And at this point, I'm seriously, the Allies won the war. We won the war. It's over. It's been 75 years. It's okay to let it out now. And one can also not say that Diebner did not know what he was doing, because in 1947 he patented the first nuclear propulsion unit for large cargo ships. Now I wonder where he would get such an idea. After all, he had witnessed the first core meltdown of a nuclear reactor in Gotha, so he of all people knew the pitfalls and dangers. And he and Schumann set up a lab not far from the huge testing grounds in Thüringen near Jonasthal, in the small town of Stadt Ilm, where he had a nuclear reactor set up in the basement of a simple schoolhouse and ran it of a large diesel generator. Thus, in the neighborhood of where one of the largest SS bomb tests were conducted by SS General Kammler, which were witnessed by scores of people, as were the aftermath, and better yet, officers from the Postal Service program were also seen here in the days before. But one of the most important construction sites, which many of you will never have heard of, took place here in Jonasthal, near Ohrdruf in Germany. Sonderbauvorhabe S3, supervised, of course, by General Hans Kammler. It was a project just like Project Riese. One could say it was a sister project. Same amount of forced laborers, resources. It was reported to be a Hitler's headquarters, and yet today there's very little to show for it. However, that is very far from where the story ends. Kurt Diebner had a nuclear research lab near here. Heereswaffenamt, for which he worked, tested specialty weapons here at the proving grounds, still today run by the German military, and very much off limits.
Das Burgfräulein von der Wachsenburg, die hat also mit ihrer Familie auf dieser Burg gelebt und hat dort die Gastronomie geführt. Die hat einen Hinweis bekommen, geh doch mal auf den Turm heute Abend und sieh mal rüber zum Truppenübungsplatz, wir machen da was. Wenn das gelingt, gewinnen wir vielleicht den Krieg noch. Auch so ein Satz deutet eigentlich darauf hin, dass es nicht um herkömmliche Waffen gegangen sein kann. Ja. Denn die deutsche Generalität hat ja die Entwicklung von Atombomben als Atomkackerei vertan, weil man in der Anfangszeit Polen und Russland überrannt hat und auch so schnell vorwärts kam. Erst 1943 nach Stalingrad, als man auf dem Rückzug war, da hat man permanent nach sogenannten Wunderwaffen gesucht. Ja. Ja, da wurde es dann wieder wichtig, also hat man auch Zeit verloren. Und Die Claire Werner hat von der Waxenburg eine Explosion gesehen, die sie beschrieben hat, in Rot, außen Gelb, und es wäre ein großer Sturm auf die Burg gekommen, eine Druckwelle sicherlich. Ja. Fatalerweise hat sie auch gesagt, in den umliegenden Orten hätten am nächsten Tag SS-Ärzte sehr viel zu tun gehabt, weil Leute Nasenbluten hatten und Ähnliches. Und daraus ist dann sehr schnell eine atomare Explosion gemacht worden, auch von Schriftstellern halt, die auch Bücher schreiben und so weiter, ohne dass das irgendjemand beweisen konnte. Ne? Und Claire Werner kannte das Wort Atombombe ja sowieso noch nicht. Ne? Das ist zu einer Zeit, wo das völlig neu war. Und eine zweite Aussage, Heinz Wachsmuth, der hier dienstverpflichtet war, der hat behauptet, er hätte am nächsten Tag oder sogar 2 Tage lang unter Vollschutz dort auf dem Truppenübungsplatz viele Leichen einsammeln müssen und auf Scheiterhaufen schmeißen müssen, was nahelegt, dass man dort Häftlinge in gewissen Abständen zum Epizentrum aufgestellt hat, um die Wirkung zu sehen. Also wenn das gemacht worden ist, ist es natürlich eine große Schweinerei. Ja? Und es müssen Leute überlebt haben. Also es gab Leute, die noch aus den Gebüschen gekrochen kamen, wo so sagt, das ist ja in der Aussage zu sehen, und die SS dann sofort erschossen hat. Ja. Und die wurden alle verbrannt. Und wenn ich jetzt nochmal an die Befreiung des Nordlagers denke, General Patton und der Besuch von Eisenhower, die diesen Verbrennungsplatz dort oben sehen, ja, dann fragt man sich doch, warum wurden Leichen, die eigentlich begraben sind, nochmal verbrannt? Krematorien gab es ja nicht in Otto. Was sollte da vertuscht werden, ist die eigentliche Frage. Waren das auch noch Opfer dieser Explosion? Wollte man vielleicht zahlenmäßig was vertuschen? Das sind alles solche Fragen. Ja? Und die Frage, ob Deutschland an der Atombombe gearbeitet hat, die steht eigentlich nicht. Natürlich haben die dran gearbeitet. Ja? Ja. Da bin ich felsenfest von überzeugt. Wie weit man gekommen ist, ist die Frage. Den Geheimdienstbericht von Flerow muss ein Mann mit gutem technischen Verständnis gewesen sein, der über diese Explosion berichtet. Und er berichtet an Kurtschatow. Kurtschatow war ja der Chef vom Atombombenprogramm der Russen, der Sowjets. Und er berichtet also ganz genau, als ob er dabei gewesen wäre, wie die Bombe aufgebaut worden ist, dass die unter großer SS-Bewachung an die Stelle der Explosion geführt worden ist, dass die an einem Gestell aufgehangen worden ist. Also er muss, man sagt, fast dabei gewesen sein, oder er muss einen Zugang gehabt haben über einen Verbindungsmann, der genau wusste, was passiert. Und er berichtet das an Kurtschatow, und Kurtschatow prüft sicherlich auf Plausibilität und berichtet an den Geheimdienstchef und so weiter und an Stalin. Und er berichtet 1:1. Das, was Flerow gesagt hat. Und an Stalin berichtet man, glaube ich, keinen Unsinn. Der bläst einen aus wie eine Kerze. Ja? Das hätte sich keiner gewagt. Also mit anderen Worten, man hat hier irgendeinen Test gemacht. Vielleicht so eine Hochleitungsbombe wie Diebner die gebaut hat, wie er sie entwickelt hat. Ob in dem Kern jetzt gleich Uran 235 war, das kann ich nicht sagen. Eigentlich ging es ja nur um den Grad der Verdichtung bei so einem Test. Aber es kann natürlich auch ein Minimalmaterial drin gewesen sein. Das können wir nicht sagen. Ja? Aber den Test muss es gegeben haben.
So, what do we really have here in Thüringen? Well, a lot of German World War II weapons industry, Luftwaffe factories, and huge underground communication centers, an unknown amount of underground installations, and a huge amount of known underground installations and factories, even an Me-262 plant 40 kilometers away from here, Diebner's test reactor 10 kilometers away from the testing site across from the hills here. And the most fun part of it all, the officer who told Claire Werner about the test, told her to go to the tower that night. Well, he worked for the German Postal Service. Remember them? They had their own nuclear program. Von Ardenne worked for the Russians after the war and developed their nuclear bomb. The Russian scientists confirmed the validity of the German wartime bomb designs also. And of course, we had SS General Kammler in charge of it all, and his chief designer Fiebinger, who, after the war, consulted the U.S. Army engineers in the U.S. on how to build underground missile launch pads. Oh well. And of course, we have loads of eyewitnesses who testified on the wounded after the bomb test. And furthermore, eyewitnesses who testified to delivering materials to completed tunnel systems throughout the war. Now, what completed tunnel systems are they exactly? Because we still have to see them. Now, at this time, there is no shortage of German scientists who had Nobel Prizes and other various science prizes which they've compiled. They were all incredibly intelligent people whom before the war were far, far ahead of their game when it came to weapons, technology, science, and nuclear development. So certainly I think there's every reason to believe that they did something with those skills. Or are we simply to believe the narrative that they somehow forgot everything they knew right up until May 1945? Now, of course we know that the Allies won the war, and we know the Germans did not deploy masses of nuclear weapons against the Allies. However, that simply does not mean they didn't have the technology or had perfected it. They had the resources, the skills, and at least through the SS, the backing and funding needed to perfect such a weapon. But they were also clever people, knowing that using such a weapon would call upon them the wrath of the Allies and the Russians who were right on their borders, and destroying Moscow or London would not stop the millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks now poised on their frontiers. So maybe a deal was made. Another reason why Diebner and Schumann's work may have been left unnoticed is because they were not working on a conventional nuclear bomb. They were working on a hydrogen bomb, designed that is much smaller by utilizing thermonuclear fission. This had been realized already in 1934 by various scientists, including Paul Hartek, led by the fusion of the two heavy hydrogen atoms, producing helium and liberating large pulses of energy. This is the basis of the modern hydrogen bomb. Still, we don't know how advanced Diebner's research was. We do know that Diebner tried to write and publish a book after the war on his work. However, this was suppressed by the Allies. But for what reason? And we know that Schumann also ended up building bombs for the Russians after the war. It was not until the 1950s that the Americans made a successful tactical battlefield nuclear weapon to be fired from an artillery piece or small rocket. Now, if the Germans were successful in developing a small nuclear plutonium bomb, as von Ardenne said he did, he said he built a bomb about the size of a pineapple. Several sources stated all over the meeting with Schellenberg in Berlin stated that a bomb between 1 and 3 kilograms had been built, and that would fit into the nose cone of the V1 and V2 and Rheinboden rockets. So now I don't have any reason to doubt that Ardenne built a bomb. He built bombs for the Russians. He knew what he was doing, and the people that worked around him, they knew what they were doing, and they were massively well funded, far better than Heisenberg was. That would lend us to believe that the Germans did have a small tactical nuclear type weapon they could have deployed in their rockets. Paul Hartek, he headed the project for the German army, and he realized early on the potential of nuclear power and weaponry. He was a central figure in the development of the ultracentrifuge used to enrich uranium. Now, we always thought that the nuclear bomb, weapons programs, projects had to be huge like the Manhattan Project was. However, Hartek's team of only 8 men were able to enrich 50 grams of uranium a day using ultracentrifuges or double centrifuges, and that puts things in a much different perspective. The Germans were looking for and approaching this in a completely different manner than their extremely well-funded and large Manhattan Project. Another important person was Professor Walter Gerlach. He was a specialist in spin polarization, magnetic field resonance, and gravitation. There's another link between him and the SS and the nuclear research program. Initially he reported to Göring's office, then eventually to Himmler, and thus, as the SS was taking over the programs, he became head of Reichsforschungsamt. Now, did you, by the way, wonder why an expert in gravitation was now working in the nuclear weapons program? I told you, there is a lot more to this than rockets and bombs. We must also mention Walter Bothe, who worked for the German army in Heidelberg. He was instrumental in bringing in the first cyclotron online. And from research, we now know that Germany had a number of these cyclotrons in use in different locations. It is confirmed by the US Air Force report, and Von Ardenne claimed to have delivered several of these to Lower Silesia, to one of the locations for the special SS research programs and sites of the Project Riese. And of course the SS had their own department for nuclear research under the direction of SS General Shaw and the Kammler staff, as well as a special research center on the rocket scientist Rolf Ingel and a special research staff at the Skoda-Werke in Pilsen under Wilhelm Voss. The German rocket program had its birth in 1920 at Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, right next to where Diebner would build his nuclear research facility. There's always been a connection between the two, and it was later unified under SS command under General Kammler. We know that top scientists such as Wernher von Braun, who was involved in the rocket research from the 1920s, he later became the star at NASA and got America to the moon. And of course, General Walter Dornberger, the former artillery general, now in charge of the rocket program, he also ended up at NASA. Eventually, the rocket team was moved to Peenemünde testing grounds on the Baltic Sea, where tens of thousands of workers were laboring, building, developing rockets and missiles. It was everything one would expect a rocket program to be. Enormous production buildings, fuel facilities, power plants, and the rocket launch facilities. Here they researched and built V-2 rockets parallel with the Army's, who was constructed and testing the V-1. Their later war ground-to-air missiles were designed here, and quite a few other things as well. The first V-2 rockets fired at London was in September 1944, and interestingly enough, the initial cleanup crews were equipped with Geiger counters to monitor for radiation. Clearly they suspected something afoul. The British scientists had been hampered by infighting and rivalries, having downplayed the German rocket and nuclear threat, now caught completely off guard as the missiles began slamming down around them. And after the war, von Braun mentioned to American reporters the German plans for attaching an incredible powerful warhead to the rockets. There are a few things one must keep in mind when looking back on the Third Reich. One is that we live in a world where the SS were setting the agenda. And one also needs to remember that it was an organization with deep ties to German industry and a strong belief in capitalism. From the outset of his campaign in the 20s, Hitler courted various big businesses, bankers, successfully. Relationships were made already then, most of which we can follow during the war, leading to a vast complex of special and top-secret research projects. Many of them were controlled by the SS, but even when not, they were still never very far away and could at any point access any other projects or findings. Now make no mistake about it, the SS was a profitable business, and the money was made on obtaining business contracts for the Reich, renting out forced laborers. As the SS ran most of the concentration camp system, they had control over millions of prisoners that were put to work, rented out to businesses, hired by the SS, and everybody made money. Certainly as the war went on, the SS took over more and more of the programs and production. And Himmler had a keen interest in the rocket program as well as the nuclear program. More and more scientists and research programs came under the auspices of the SS. Adolf Hitler was beginning to get impressed, imagining what the new technology could do. And after Fritz Todt died, the builder of the Reich, the architect of the Reich, Albert Speer, took his place. He eventually would work closely with the SS in all the construction projects needed, and SS General Hans Kammler was put in charge of the rocket program, as well as the development of the new jet fighters previously under Göring. But as Kammler had early on worked for the Luftwaffe construction, and he and Göring got on well together, Göring did not object, as the young SS officer rose to the top and amassed a huge amount of power in record time. Now, General Kammler would recruit the best scientists, both known and unknown, for his secret research staff, the Kammlerstab. And it seems that he was everywhere, building everything. Regardless where I went, from the submarine pens, V2 test sites, to underground fuel headquarters, the Allied bombing of German cities and industry made it critical to build enormous underground complexes for construction. Also, Hitler's various headquarters needed to be reinforced, and much of the secret research was decentralized for safety as well. Yet in the middle of all this underground construction, we still find special S-Vorhabe construction projects, following briefings to Hitler and contemporary claims that two of them were to be large headquarters for Hitler and his staff. That would be Project Riese and the S3 in Jonastal near Ordorf, Germany. Both had 26 or 28,000 forced laborers, and an enormous amount of resources were spent on both sites. Hitler was briefed on both repeatedly, and yet, interestingly enough, there's practically nothing to see in either one of these sites. However, something is missing from the official story, and something is missing that can still be found. And after what I have so far seen, I have doubts that either one of them were actually to be headquarters for Hitler at all. After Peenemünde was bombed by the Allies, Kammler, now in charge of the fighter staff, began to move key German Air Force and rocket production and research underground. He picked Nordhausen, where the central works located in tunnels dug into the mountains would become the largest underground factory that we know of. Here V1 and V2s as well as jet fighters would be built and assembled. The SS would provide labor from Buchenwald concentration camp. This was a huge factory operation, but very far from Kammler's only large underground site, as we will see. Now, the rocket program, as we've been told, was initially full of birthing problems. Where it went to manufacturing, mass production, many more problems. And it was not initially a very accurate weapon either. Certainly not one that would be possible for tactical use until its defects were fixed. Thousands and thousands of these were built and launched, along with thousands and thousands of V1s. Some of them were air-launched from airplanes, and some of them fired from mobile launchers. Already in 1942, the huge V2 rocket facility building and firing location on the coasts of France were being constructed, almost at the same time as the rockets were supposedly entering their final stage of development, and basically before production started. One thing you need to keep in mind was the German way of doing things. As soon as they had something in mind or a concept, they started building and preparing for its mass production and deployment. At times before its kinks were worked out, causing many production issues and wasted construction projects. But towards the end of the war, the V2 had been fine-tuned and was now far closer to battlefield use. And after the Allies had managed to cross the Rhine, the bridge at Remagen still stood. SS General Kammler stepped up to the plate and fired V2 rockets from 130 miles away. Now, they did not hit the bridge. The closest impact was 500 meters away. However, enough accumulated damage to the bridge came from that and other bombings that eventually the bridge did come down, but it was a sign of things to come. Now, due to the Allied bombing campaign, the construction of the V2s and V1 rockets and the Me-262 jet fighter, the HE-163, was all moved underground. But not only at Doha Mittelbau complex. Huge underground complexes throughout the Reich were now found under the U relocation program to move industry underground, either into existing mines or tunnels, or new ones would be constructed, as well as huge above-ground bunkers large enough to house production, such as the Remark, also in Thüringen. There was also a lot of construction going on in Czechoslovakia and in Lower Silesia, which is today Poland. These are very important sites, which have so far not been properly researched as all documentation is completely missing and the archives are closed. Ostentatiously, many of these would be rocket and research facilities. But so much more than missiles and nuclear was being developed by the German scientists at the time. But if we can now link the German rocket program to the German nuclear program as one entity, such as under the same SS umbrella, under Kammler, under Himmler, it would be a program with an unlimited amount of funding, an unlimited amount of labor. They could produce whatever they wanted with the slave labor they did not need to pay. Not only that, but they also had the support, both financial and research support, from huge German businesses, IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, AEG, and many other donors. But why is it that we know what we think we know about the German nuclear bomb project? Why has it been discounted as subpar? With the invasion of France, the Alsace teams were sent to Europe. They were tasked with finding and obtaining, documenting all German nuclear research programs. They were headed by Colonel Forrest T. Pash. They were probably looking for a Manhattan-sized project, since in Allied terms, nuclear bomb projects were huge and expensive, not knowing of Hartek's team of 8 who were able to produce uranium with a lot less. Also, the Alsace teams immediately, upon arriving outside Germany's borders, denounced the German nuclear program. In fact, they were in Strasbourg when they did so. They never did visit the factories in the east, the Riese locations, or the ones in Czechoslovakia, the Skoda-Werke, that all came under Russian control. And I doubt they had, at the time they made this statement, a full appreciation of what Bergkristall or Jonastal was all going to be. It was not until late 45 they visited the weapons manufacturing plant of Skoda-Werke, only briefly, and only after most materials had been seized or hidden away, and it had come under Soviet control. Nor did they visit the SS secret research facilities thrown towards now East Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, nor those in Poland. So we can ask ourselves, why did they make such a stunning statement already in 1944, that the Germans had no interesting nuclear programs? There was no way for them of knowing the full scope of the 11 different compartmentalized, decentralized nuclear and research projects going on in Germany. And certainly they had not broken into the SS weapons research program that was all hidden way out in Czechoslovakia. The initial farm hall recordings were edited to reflect the reality the Allies wanted to put out, and had wanted to put out ever since 1944 with the first Alsace reports, that the Germans didn't have a nuclear program that was worth anything. They were far behind, because on one hand you don't want to spread panic. Obviously the war is still going on in 44, and after you win the war you don't want to admit that the Germans had managed to do something that you couldn't do for several months to come, or maybe even you needed German technology in order to complete. Certainly didn't want to admit that. Also, the scientists at Farm Hall, none of them were on the Kammlerstab. None of them were read into the special access programs of the SS, of the special compartmentalized weapons production, weapons research that Kammler was running. So they had no idea how far advanced he was. And Heisenberg already gave credit to Diebner for being ahead of him on several points before. So did the scientists at Farm Hall not also know that they were being recorded? Well, they were really intelligent people. Yes, they probably did. And there would probably still be a fear of a post-war Nazi SS entity that would not be so forgiving if they were talking. The initial version of Hitler's table talks was edited to exclude any reference to the nuclear bomb project. So much have been altered before release to support the narrative that the Germans didn't have a program. And if that was the case, why are all these files still sealed and classified? And why is the Austrian government still shutting down any excavation anywhere near where radioactivity or particle accelerated parts, things are found that would support that the Germans actually had some sort of an atomic or plutonium bomb? Or another thing that must be said is that Boris T. Pash, who ran the Alsace teams, eventually ended up working for the CIA, an agency that has, shall we say, a reputation for hiding the truth of things and an elaborate post-war network collaborations with former Nazi officers. As the war progressed, the SS was setting the agenda for Germany. The SS organization originated as a bodyguard for Adolf Hitler, but it evolved and it grew to an extremely large, dedicated force, both militarily and politically. It was led by Heinrich Himmler and would eventually infiltrate pretty much all parts of German life. They were very well-trained SS field battalions who fought on all fronts alongside the German army. There was the Allgemeine SS, who handled, ran, constructed the labor camps. There was SS intelligence services, police brigades, and law enforcement. Most Gestapo police officers also held rank in the SS. Now, it is an interesting side note that Heinrich Himmler was extremely fascinated by ancient Germanic history. Thus, in 1935, Himmler founded the Ahnenerbe, which was the SS archaeologists' historical organization tasked with research into ancient Germanic past and ancient texts. They would indeed travel across the world to find, well, we don't exactly know what it was they were looking for. Modern historians have pretty much discounted the Ahnenerbe as a bunch of Nazi archaeologists with guns. However, what is interesting about them is that they grew to over 50 departments. Himmler designed his castle Wewelsburg full of ancient Germanic ruins and symbols, and it seems strange because many SS managers and high-ranking officers were incredibly pragmatic people that would probably frown ever so slightly on their boss's inclination towards the esoteric. And yet high-ranking SS generals was heard referring to meetings at Wewelsburg, Himmler's castle, conversations they had in relation to building projects of future SS cities. What we need to understand is the SS was not just a militarized version of the Nazi Party. It was an ideology, and the SS were taking over. And their vision for Germany was going to be the one that would fill German life after the war had been won. In this document, it is clearly noted, alongside the war-winning programs, that an incredibly important for the SS were the Ahnenerbe programs. And the secret Ahnenerbe locations were mentioned and scouted out by high-ranking SS generals in top secrecy, which leads me to believe that there may be more to this. Now, historian Joseph P. Farrell have laid out a great case that they were actually looking for ancient technologies, thinking way outside the box of established technology and science, seeking ancient texts, scouring them from information of ancient weapon systems. Now, beyond being an old-school confidant of Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler ran the SS and all its different organizations. The SS was known for having exceptional, efficient, and brutal managers in key positions, answering only to Himmler, who answered only to Hitler, and very well-financed research by German businesses. Ironically, at the end of the war, Himmler sent a small SS task force to blow up his beloved castle and salvage whatever was in the safe. So when American soldiers found his secret safe, it was empty, and its content has never been seen since. But the rising star and next-generation officer in the SS was Dr. Hans Kammler, or SS General Hans Kammler. He is one of the most mysterious people who have lived, and yet most people has never heard of him. And yet, towards the end, he was one of the most powerful people in the Third Reich. His power would eventually rival Himmler's, and his ability to affect the war and events would parallel that of Hitler, if not surpass it towards the end. So who was Hans Kammler? He was eventually in charge of rocket operations, head of Amtsgruppe C, of the SS, Wirtschaft und Verwaltungshauptamt, the Jägerstab, and many other things. Kammler rose through the ranks within the SS and the government from 1930s. At one point he held a high-ranking position within the Air Ministry, overseeing all construction and large building programs. The connection to the German Luftwaffe would return in Kammler's professional life within the SS. He rose through various government assignments and excelled rapidly. He was young, talented, extremely ambitious, and according to his children, he was a good father and happily married with 5 children. However, 2 of them died as infants. In a short time, Kammler became one of the most powerful generals in the SS. Towards the end of the war, he coordinated and oversaw all secret weapon programs of Germany. He also oversaw research into nuclear propulsion, weapons and rockets. His secret team, the Kammlerstab, researched technology so advanced it apparently still is classified today. And at a point where both Himmler and Hitler were no longer able to influence events, Kammler remained free to do so. He ran projects so secret not even the top of the SS or the government knew of their existence. He did work closely with Walter Dornberger and von Braun. He was, after all, their boss. He also worked extremely well and close with Wilhelm Voss, the director of the Skoda-Werke, the largest weapons manufacturing plant under the German control. He also held access to quite a few secret bank accounts in Zurich, something the Allies would question him about after the war, as documents have shown. He was apparently captured and surrendered to the Americans in May 1945, supposedly, and then he disappeared from history forever, and so did his research. There are some 14 different accounts of how he died, was killed, committed suicide, and his wife had him declared dead at the end of the war. End of story. He was only mentioned at Nuremberg some 17 times, with no further questions. Now for several decades, the American archives have steadily bled reports of what happened to Kammler, and the fact that he appeared to have been in American care after the war. His movements of the last month of the war have been fairly well documented, especially since the OSS had targeted him and several other high-ranking SS generals for assassination. At one point, they may have bombed Nordhausen, killing 8,000 prisoners and German civilians because they believed he was there, and he was. So clearly, he was a known entity to the Allies, and important enough to go through an all-out trouble to kill. But what happened to his research, and what was he really doing after the war? Dr. Wilhelm Voss, director of the Skoda armaments work in Czechoslovakia, said in the last years of the war, central command for the development, manufacturing of the most secret weapons and equipment was in the hands of SS Gruppeführer Dr. Hans Kammler and his special staff. It included secret weapons, equipment, and processes which are either in use or which were not yet in use at the time. As much as I know, he said, this mainly involved work in areas of atomic fragmentation, the conversion of elements, the atomic bomb, and nuclear energy, and additional rockets, and the latest airplane propulsion systems, and remote control. On April 3, 1945, Kammler met for the last time with Adolf Hitler, according to Joseph Goebbels' diary. He noted, the Führer had a very long conversation with Obergruppenführer Kammler, who now bears much of the responsibility for the reform of the Luftwaffe on his shoulders. Kammler is doing well, and great hopes rest on him. Wilhelm Voss characterized Kammler as follows, and I quote, he was the head of a staff of specialists who developed highly special secret weapons of war equipment. Whereas, up to a recent date, each branch of the Wehrmacht and its competent authorities had their development carried out separately, Kammler succeeded in his field with a centralized command for all branches. Kammler also oversaw the construction and design of the labor camps throughout Germany and German occupied territories, giving him the full run of any skilled laborers he needed from any labor camp system. he also had a free run to scour German universities and schools for anyone talented to come work for his think tank. Walter Dornberger testified that Heisenberg reported to him on the progress of his nuclear programs. Now, remember, Dornberger worked for Kammler at this time. He also stated that in Germany at the end of the war, there were 11 special technical programs. All of them operated on a need-to-know basis, high level of secrecy and compartmentalization. And they noted that there would be a very few people in Nazi Germany who would have access to all such programs and information. In fact, to my knowledge, General Kammler was the only one. This, of course, links Dornberger, Heisenberg, rockets, and the nuclear program, and Kammler together. Now it is known that Hans Kammler was able to coordinate all these scattered German efforts at the same time as he ran his own secret projects with his own staff. Interestingly enough, remembering that both von Braun and Dornberger, supposedly the rocket specialists, were not on the Kammlerstab in his special facility in the mountains of Czechoslovakia. Also, Kammler and von Ardenne knew each other well and worked together. Years before, Himmler had recommended both he and Dornberger, both as board members, on von Ardenne's research installation staff. In 1944, in June, scientists had a conference in Berlin. With Walter Schellenberg and Otto Skorzeny, many of the top scientists were present, and notes were made. Schumann reported that the problem with the uranium bomb had been solved, and von Ardenne stated he had created a superweapon. The chief of the Russian Army Intelligence, Lieutenant General Ilushev, reported to General Antonov that the Germans had detonated a nuclear bomb in Ohrdruf on March 23, 1945. I visited this test site, and it's the one we have aerial photos of. This was also testified to by several independent sources and reported to Stalin. It was witnessed by locals and prisoners of war as well. There's a report found in the Russian archives from Marshal Zhukov to Stalin on October 2, 1945, in which he explains to Stalin that the Germans have made an atomic bomb. But we have to remember that Germans were not just pursuing a Hiroshima-size and type bomb. There are many different German scientists working on different types of nuclear weaponry. Since the war, several reports have come to light from the Russian presidential archives, one from March 23rd and one from November 44, clearly outlining German nuclear weaponry and their test in Thüringen. Furthermore, the GRU reports specify that this was a bomb was 1.5 meters long. The report further states that the bomb was designed by interconnected hollow spheres and had an incredible destructive power. Kochertov, the director of the Soviet atomic bomb project, had received several alarming reports on the German bomb, stating that the Germans would be able to create efficient bombs from implosion principles. The report further states that Germans had conducted several such tests and trees within 600-meter radius had been flattened. Soviet prisoners of war had been brought up close to the site, and 600 of them had been pulverized by the explosion. Furthermore, a strong radioactive effect had been observed after the blast. Davidoff, the Soviet expert on nuclear weapons, examined the plans and concluded that the Germans had a well-thought-out plan for a nuclear weapon. Soviet nuclear bomb experts had to conclude and recognize some of the more modern elements in the German design, such as the high-voltage discharge tube, not seen until later bombs in the West. Lev Davidoff concluded that the drawings of the German bomb was exactly like the post-war Russian bomb designs, or was the Russian bomb based on the German designs from the war. After the war, Stalin wanted to know how far the Germans got in their design for a bomb. Marshal Zhukov wrote him back that the Germans had completed the design and application of nuclear power and had assigned an application of a nuclear bomb. Thus, it is clearly noted in the Russian files and archives that the Germans had developed a nuclear bomb during the Second World War. But also files in the French archives from April 1945 noted a test of an electronuclear bomb test by the Germans where Russian and Polish POWs had been incinerated. Also from Hitler himself, transcripts of the Antonescu visiting in 1944, the Russians were closing in, and the war was coming to an end for his country, and he wanted out. Hitler assured him he had a new weapon, a V3 and a V4, and a bomb so powerful it would destroy anything within 3 kilometers radius. Now, whether this was a nuclear bomb or an extremely large coal dust bomb is unclear, but it is clear that the Germans had developed a very powerful coal dust bomb and had been testing these in their Nebelwerfer rocket system, a system that had also been tested from submerged submarines. After the war, a French political memo citing that Germany had been only 6 months away from being able to fully industrialize production of nuclear bombs. Remember, Germans set up production as soon as they had a working concept, just like with the rockets. Now, before Italy left the war, Alberto Romersa, an Italian journalist, went on an expedition for Mussolini to Germany to take a look at what the Germans had of secret weapons. He also claimed to have personally visited this and several other nuclear bomb test sites. In 1947, a CIC report from 19 August operational report states that a transfer of 4 boxes containing documents, research data, instruments, and substances connected to guided missile and atomic energy was transferred by the Sicherheitsdienst from Tuschla Heide in northern Poland to Italy. The town in Poland was coupled with research of guided missiles. V1, V2 rockets were tested there, and after the Russians got too close to Peenemünde. This report further connects rocketry with the nuclear research, and in the boxes were, amongst other things, ampoules labeled U-234 and U-235 and PLU. Also in this report it was mentioned that a Dr. Nils Werner Larsen, formerly on the Kammlerstab and now at Tuschla Heide, produced a number of atomic bombs weighing between 1 and 5 kilograms. Clara Werner witnessed the blast from the castle near Ohrdruf where she was working in March 1945. She was previously told by an officer from the postal service that something special would happen that night, and if it was successful, it could win them the war. And she saw a big, slim column rise into the air, so bright that one could have read a newspaper by it. She has never changed or altered her testimony or story, and the forensics of the possibility of her witnessing this from where she was is absolutely possible. And Allied aerial photographs from that time bears witness of this test. Remember that the lab Diebner had set up with the reactor was not far from Ohrdruf at all. And days before the Alsos team arrived there, he packed it up and was last seen with his trucks driving south. However, the Alsos team's reports from Stad Ilm was that, I quote, they found pay dirt, so something must have been left over there, but that discovery was later downplayed. This is where Diebner's nuclear research ended. At the end of the war, he had moved from Kummersdorf and Guttorf, and this is where the final research of the German nuclear weapons project was housed, in this small little building. And as we walk into this small, unassuming building, in the floor is the hole from a reactor core, just like the one at Heigelok. This we did not expect to see here. I thought this was just a lab. What is interesting is I had absolutely no idea that he actually put a reactor here. I did not know that. I thought he did research here, yes, absolutely. I did not know there was an actual reactor on this site. And you see on the walls you have all the, where you had the power. And above this was the school.
vorbereiten.
Ob es jetzt wirklich so gewesen ist, dass ich Bombe herweisen habe.
Und ganz wie in Gotthard.
Besides these two basement rooms, there was the entire school building above of several stories that was taken over by Diebner's lab. I believe in one of these there was a diesel generator located to provide power for the electricity, as this was the case in Heigelock. However, Gerlach had obtained enough electricity promised from the local Gauleiter for experiments to continue.
And here's the second chamber. Right next to the first one, you actually have connections between the two. Lots of air irrigation in here. And this was underneath the school, and of course he took over the whole school, which makes this look quite a lot bigger. So there was a connection between the two rooms through this gate here.
Okay. That is exactly what I was going to ask you. So what is that?
That's not that much. I mean, we were at the other reactor, there was nothing. So that's not really strange.
Here was no accident. Maybe some grains broken off.
You got more than background, but it's not hot.
I'm not glowing in the dark yet, and we did the Geiger tests. There's also very little radiation here. So as I said to the great people of this town, you absolutely have to make a museum here, because a lot of people, they just don't know that in this small town was one of Diebner's war-time nuclear reactors. Nobody knows this. Here Kurt Diebner was going to improve on his reactor from Gotthard. He had calculated that hollow uranium spheres would be more efficient than cubes, and he had enough for low-temperature experiments. He also had a quantity of heavy water, enough for interim experiments. And a uranium reduction plant was on its way here when the war ended. A few of those have been set up throughout Germany. One more reactor was located at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in an underground bunker. In 1944, the last experiment here, B7, conducted by Karl Witz, using ordinary water, not heavy water, and by using a carbon reflector giving higher neutron multiplicity. In January 1945, a half a ton of heavy water and hundreds of uranium cubes left Berlin and arrived here at Stadt Ilm, along with Diebner wearing an army uniform. It was clear for a while, but certainly from January, February, that Heisenberg was working to oppose Diebner's attempts to create a bomb. He went to Stadt Ilm to see Gerlach in order to have all the uranium and heavy water from Berlin sent on to his reactor in Heigelock. Here the power supply for the lab was simply provided by a diesel generator set up in an adjacent room, much the same as I suspect was the case here in Stadt Ilm. On April 3rd, Diebner loaded papers, materials, heavy water and uranium on trucks, along with those soldiers and scientists who could travel, and set out direction south before the Americans arrived a week later. During the Second World War, the Germans had extremely advanced technology. There were cyclotrons, betatrons, uranium reduction plants, particle accelerators, and much more, things we still don't know of. And certainly these efforts have been downplayed by mainstream historians and governments ever since. And given the notoriety Heisenberg have received as the one man who's deliberately failed, he have a nice museum built to his anti-Nazi stance up at Heigelock at his reactor site there, while Diebner's reactors go unrecognized. Yet it was Diebner's post-war nuclear reactor designs that powered German cargo ships after the war. But Diebner was a party man, and he took a different approach to the nuclear science, and he was trying to make a bomb. while it was clear that Heisenberg was actively trying to oppose his efforts. Also, many of the German scientists were still in contact with their counterparts outside of Germany. It is strange that Diebner, who had the armies, the SS, backing by Bormann, Himmler, could not cut through these efforts to hinder his work by somebody like Heisenberg, who was not particularly liked by SS or Himmler. Initially, in 1943, the Army High Command had agreed to release 5,000 scientists from active service for the nuclear research projects. In 1944, Himmler ordered a further 14,600 scientists released for this effort. This was seconded by Göring and Bormann. Speer, however, did not agree, but was obviously overruled. Of course, if Diebner succeeded and Heisenberg was the distraction, it all makes more sense. And given what the Russians found after the war that we know of, one may wonder what the Americans actually did find or had handed over. Given the top leadership from SS, Himmler, Kammler, Bormann had all backed this effort, it cannot have been insignificant. And there was a time for Diebner to evacuate materials, and for the SS to hide others, leaving the door wide open as to what actually happened here. We know at least 5.5 tons of uranium cubes were produced during the war that we know of. Diebner's bomb design needed a lot less, and there was nuclear labs producing something during the war that we still have not found or been told of. Also after the war, the later head of the Russian nuclear program, George Flerov, spent a lot of time, similar to the American Alsos teams, trying to obtain information about the German nuclear research. In 1983, Flerov had recounted how a German prisoner, a scientist, had worked for the Postal Service but was tasked with installing several cyclotrons in underground labs run by the SS. A well-known declassified document is the Cinsa affidavit. The National Archive file number was APO 696. This was interrogation report with German test pilot Hans Cinsa. This file could be considered evidence. The missile expert says he observed in 1944 a mushroom cloud in the sky during a test flight near Ludwigslust, proving ground in Lublin. His log was submitted to the Allied investigators, and it read, "In early October 1944, I flew 12 to 15 kilometers from a nuclear test station near Ludwigslust, south of Lübeck. A cloud shaped like a mushroom, with the turbulence billowing sections at about 7,000 meters, stood without any sealing connection over the spot where the explosion took place. Strong electrical disturbance and the impossibility to continue radio communication also turned up." And if all this evidence was not enough that the Germans had some sort of large nuclear technology, when German submarine 234 arrived in Norfolk several weeks after the war in Europe had ended, having deliberately evaded British and Canadian warships intended only to surrender to the Americans, it had been quite well documented what the submarine carried. Initially, supposedly, it was headed for Japan, and it was described in detail in Kader Heydrich's book, as well as 1,000 pounds of uranium oxide, and a complete Me-262 in boxes, a Luftwaffe General, and a bunch of infrared proximity detonators and their creator, Hans Schlickert. Why they were important? Well, the US needed these to set off their bomb. There were the plans for V-1s and V-2 rockets, other secret designs, bomb sites, radars, and one of Kammler's pet projects, the HS-293, invented by Herbert A. Wagner, one of Kammler's scientists from Nordhausen.
At a time where it was clear that the war was lost and Hitler put out orders to destroy everything, technology and everything, so it doesn't fall in the hands of the Allies. And Kammler is even writing Hitler for permission to destroy things so the Russians don't get them, fighters without fuel and so on and so forth. To pack a submarine with all the most secret projects, uranium oxide, infrared proximity sensors, the guy who invented them, and Me-262, Kammler's pet projects in one submarine. Very, very few people could have done this at that time, at any time, and Kammler would have to be involved. That submarine did not leave with that cargo without him being involved, and if he was involved, Bormann must have been involved, because he was all that money going around and assets with the SS. Bormann was handling the SS and the party and the funds, and Gestapo Müller must have known, because he was providing the security, one of the rings of security for the Kammlerstab. So Bormann and Müller and Kammler, who all disappeared at the end of the war, they must have been part in getting this submarine off. And I don't really see any of them having a particular interest in helping Japan. Ideologically, there was a tacit cooperation during the war, but certainly nothing that substantial, nothing that really could have been anything. And German sailors were interned and mistreated by the Japanese when Germany surrendered. So it's not like there was a whole lot of love. And for Kammler to send his pet projects and all his secret research to the Japanese, I don't see that as feasible as bargaining for it. He told on Speer on April 3rd that he was going to pack up everything and surrender to the Americans. And the Americans had been in touch with Kammler. He sent out a lot of orders to destroy things before the Russians get it, including things we don't even exactly know what was in Berlin. A lot of interesting orders went out at the same time as he packed up orders to ship all his scientists through Austria to Nordhausen so they could meet with the Americans and orderly be handed over with all the rocket science. That would not have happened. If Kammler wanted to destroy all the rockets and all the scientists and kill all the scientists, he would have shot them and he would have blown up all the tunnels with all the tech. He didn't. He specifically didn't do that. A deal was done with the Americans, and that submarine was almost certainly part of that deal. Too bad for the two Japanese officers that were on it. They weren't in on that one. But same reason where Dulles would have been part of this. Certainly Alan Dulles there was ended up as head of the CIA. There was also a connection or a point of contact between Bormann and Dulles, and General Wolf that surrendered Italy to Dulles. It was part of that negotiation. Wolf, SS General, Kammler, SS General. There are plenty of opportunities for Kammler to be in contact with the Americans. He told his wife that the Americans reached out to him, and he deliberately packed up all his assets and prepared them for the Americans.
Further documentation for this comes from von Braun and Dornberger themselves in late 1944. Dornberger and von Braun, realizing that the war was lost, had made contact through General Electric through the embassy in Lisbon. It's not entirely certain how they did this, but it's possible, as von Braun's brother Sigismund made the trip, possibly with Dornberger. Von Braun's brother was a diplomat and became the West German Secretary of State after the war. Kammler must have been informed of such a trip or endorsed it. Everything he touched was surrounded by a triple layer of security and counter-surveillance. The layers of security would have made it impossible for such high-ranking rocket scientists to travel outside of Germany or even communicate with foreign powers without his knowledge. Friedrich Freiherr von Weizsäcker was involved in the German nuclear program from the very beginning. His father, Ernst von Weizsäcker, was the ambassador to the Holy See, an important post pre-war Nazi liaison organization. He also knew von Braun's brother, of course, and he, too, could have made a good venue for communication outside the Third Reich. Now, General Electric was after the war in charge of the US V-2 Project Hermes. They visited the Skoda Werke after the war. Both then and now they are a large military contractor. After the war, von Braun became head of the GE project and its manager, traveled to Europe to pick the rocket parts and the German scientists most important to GE. Clearly, a deal had been made, and Kammler was the only one who could have arranged and endorsed it. He arranged for the entire rocket team and all parts to be safely turned over to the Americans. He left his aide in charge of overseeing the event at Nordhausen, as he headed to Prague to rescue more documentation. So despite post-war disparaging remarks made by Dornberger of Kammler, they must have been a close team, especially since at the end of the war Himmler had Dornberger imprisoned and Kammler got him out. But it's not unusual for wartime friendships to be denied after losing if it suits these individuals' agenda now. Von Braun held a secret meeting in January discussing handing over the rocket team intact to the Americans, and on the 31st, General Kammler gave the order for the rocket team to begin moving west from Peenemünde. To his wife, Kammler had stated that the Americans had reached out to him and told Albert Speer he would make a deal with the Americans, handing over everything he had. So why the secrecy? Why all the accounts of his death and suicides? Clearly, the United States and the CIA had no problem making deals with various SS and Nazi war criminals. After all, they hired Klaus Barbie for years to hunt communists in the jungles. However, General Kammler was different. He was an engineer. He was not a scientist. He did not create the atomic bombs or the rockets. He was a manager. But he knew things. He knew how to manage and organize. Now Klaus Barbie was an operator, a ruthless man who knew how to hunt partisans, and, for the CIA, communists. However, Kammler, he knew how to get things done, but hardly something that would be fitting for a job with NASA alongside his old colleagues. So what would the U.S. do with him? He handed over his documents and information, and he had already handed over the scientists and the research. Well, maybe everything. He was a smart man. I'm sure he hid a few things until he was certain he had a free pass, just like von Braun and Dornberger had hidden the documents until they were certain the Allies would give them one. After the war, the son of OSS officer Donald Richardson, who worked directly under Eisenhower as a confidant of the president, stated to his son that Kammler had come to America, where he died by suicide in 1947. That is a plausible explanation.
I also became acquainted to Mr. Richardson. He's not longer with us, and he told us that his father took over from the area of St. Georgen nuclear material for the Americans, and since he was a very important security officer for the Americans, he also was that guy that took over Hans Kammler personally, because according to Richardson's family tradition, Kammler did not commit suicide in Prague on the 9th of May. He didn't do this. He came into the hands of the Americans and was under US custody for many months, maybe 2 years or so, and it would be interesting to know what the American authorities talked with Kammler and what they have recorded and where this documentation is available today.
An interesting note. Despite how important Mr. Richardson was as a confidant to the president, the only documentation I could obtain from the archives was a copy of the invitation to his retirement party, and even that link has since disappeared.
When you follow the last route of Hans Kammler, he came from the Alps from Strobel, from the Ebensee area, and it was the liberation. The Americans came in here on May 5th. Yeah? And Hans Kammler definitely was in the area, crossed the Danube here in the area, not far from here, on May 4th, 1 day before the Americans actually came here. So, and it is a big question of history, yeah? Whether the first handshake of Hans Kammler and the Americans took place on May 4th or May 5th in this area. But it is clear that it must have been in this area. May 4th, he crossed at Enst the river, yeah, to the Mauthausen-Gusen St. Jürgen complex, yeah, and then he disappeared. Yeah. There are documents that reveal that General MacDonald considered especially Bergkristall as one of the most important strategic underground plans of Nazi Germany, because they're very likely linked to a new design, and he wrote the rocket-propelled atomic bomb.
From what I have seen, Kammler went out of his way to hand over his research, his scientists intact, to the Americans, and he had clearly been in touch with them before the end of the war. The last days before the end, he traveled towards Prague and ordered every military asset he had to protect the town from falling to the Russians until he could evacuate what he had there, which was a stone throw from Lower Silesia and the huge Riese complex. Towards the end of the war, Kammler worked furiously to consolidate his remaining assets underground in various facilities, to increase the output of the production of whatever it was he was doing. More and more documentation was becoming available, but still stopping right before we can actually learn what happened to him, or what was actually done in the places such as Bergkristall or Kellerbau, the biggest tunnel factory and research tunnels built by the SS overseen by Kammler, huge factories taken by the Americans, crammed with machinery. Yet not a single good photograph or inventory had been found of these sites, and Kammler was seen here days before he disappeared, days before the Americans took them intact. Throughout the German-occupied territories, as well as Germany and Austria proper, the SS and their research teams had taken over castles in various locations for their research and manufacturing. They had strewn the occupied territories with labor camps, and there would be a ready pool of workforce available to do whatever they needed done. Already from 1941-42, they had begun building secret underground facilities or scouting locations for these before the full brunt of the Allied Air Force was being felt. Clearly, they were ahead of the game, and in Prague, Czechoslovakia, you had the largest weapons manufacturer in Europe at the time. It was now run by Wilhelm Voss. Clearly, Kammler was represented here. He worked closely with the Skoda-Werke for manufacturing weapons and for research. And in the final days of the war, Hitler ordered Ferdinand Schroeder and the SS divisions to keep the Russians at bay and away from Prague as long as possible. Wilhelm Voss and Kammler both now, separately, went there in order to rescue something. There's something incredibly important about the area of Prague, about the Skoda-Werke, Pilsen, and the sites in the east, which was set up by Kammler. What was so important there that he needed to go there himself, with the Russians closing in around him, Berlin surrounded? Was it to rescue documents, information, hardware, wartime materials? What could be so important that both these men would risk their lives going there? Let's explore that. What did Kammler have in that part of the world? Of course, there was Rapschen, 60 miles north of Prague, VFG, Weser Flugzeugbau. There was rumored to have manufactured cyclotrons for atomic research. There were shipped out 3 there before the end of the war. This was reported by the New York Times in 1945. Huge blast doors for high security, inner checkpoints that we'll see. The Pentagon Air Force Intelligence Division confirms that 1 cyclotron was removed by the Russians after the war, an industrial-grade large cyclotron. Mid-1944, Pripyat, Czechoslovakia. This was the site of the Kammlerstab. They were housed in a large building that can still be seen today. They moved here after initially having been operating out of Hell in Poland under Rolf Ingel. These were the SS and Kammler's own research staff of scientists. What were they doing? Their research and construction and weapons manufacturing. They even housed parts here for V1s, V2s, Rheinboten, V4s, and the V101, a 140-ton rocket with an 1,100-mile range. This was claimed to have been tested here by the end of the war. This was testified to by Otto Skorzeny himself. And all this was developed without any association to the von Braun Peenemünde team. They were under the command of the mathematician and physicist Rolf Engel. He had been a member of the German Rocket Society ever since 1928. He was an early associate of von Braun, but he did hold a grudge against Dornberger. Also here they developed a new rocket codenamed Rot. Extremely qualified technicians was brought here, with no connection to any of the scientists at Peenemünde or in Germany proper. Here, as the Russians advanced to the site, it was of such importance that Russian paratroopers was apparently dropped onto it to get there before the Allies even knew it was there. So maybe now we'll never know what they found, but we can hope that one day the Russian archives will again begin to open up to some of this research. And what was it? Because all the rocket technology was out in Nordhausen, already waiting for the Allies there, right? Most of the nuclear facilities and testing was with Diebner and Ohrdruf, not far from Mittelbau, or in Bergkristall-Gusen. So what was it that was so important that both Voss and Kammler would risk their lives to hide it, protect it, or destroy it? Obviously, they wanted to get to something before the Russians did. It seemed, though, that they already had all the bargaining chips they needed to strike a deal with the Western Allies. So what was it that was so important they would drive into the jaws of the Russian army and the resistance rising in Prague against the Germans? Was this technology? Because it couldn't have been rockets or jets, and it really couldn't have been nuclear, so it must have been something else. Yet history gives no indication of what this could have been. Remember, they had an exceptional team of scientists creating something that was worth risking their lives for. Now, one thing we don't know, what Kammler was hiding, but we do know that he spent a lot of time hiding things in different places. And many of these places have been sought by treasure hunters ever since. One of them out near Prague, in a small town called Stressowice. Here was an SS school, an SS Pioneer Schule Hardisko. It was run by an SS officer, Emil Klein. He had, of course, the mandatory forced labor camp attached to it. After the war and his capture, he would spend 17 years in prison in Czechoslovakia, with the Czechs trying everything to torture out locations from him. But he drew up maps in code, and I have seen these codes and these drawings. However, it gets better. In 1947, a small U.S. team involving a bomb squad went back into Stressowice under Operation Hidden Documents. It's all since been released by the National Archives. This is no longer a secret. But they went to look for something, and they found a stash of 32 crates of something. They packed their trucks and left the area in haste, but the Czech military caught the bomb squad and held them back until, after some political wrangling, the crates were returned. However, I am quite certain that whatever the Czech military got back sometimes later was not what originally had been put in them by Klein, Kammler, or Engel. Emil Klein is claimed to have had the prisoners shot after they had dug out hiding places around the forests. Unlike prisoners of the other camps there, these were just released. According to local historians, the locations of 300 more crates were identified in an underground bunker, but this was now during the Cold War. Thus, it could not be dug out until the Cold War was coming to an end. And it was possible to get to the site. And this was so important that a team waited 40 years and then went in 91. As a joint expedition with Omnipol, being a Czech weapons dealer, teaming up with Fujiyama, a Japanese insurance company, and supposedly members of JPL or Lawrence Livermore. They were guarded by the Czech military, and they went back to a place called Metnik Hill, just around the corner from Stressowice. Here they found an underground bunker, and they excavated for several months, whereafter they filled everything up with several tons of cement Above-ground surveyors have later identified a 20 by 20 meter round underground bunker and bunker systems. Now, I've looked at bunkers all my life. I have never seen one that was round. There's no reason why anybody would want to go to the trouble to make a round underground bunker. And there's something else to this. This was so important for all this effort, so it could not just have been old World War II technologies, plans of rockets, or nuclear. These must all have been obsolete by then. There's no reason to come back after so many years with so much secrecy. So clearly Kammler and his team were doing something that still could have an impact today. Which is why I suspect most of his research and most of the papers pertaining to him and his team are still classified everywhere. Oh, by the way, one final note was that after the war, Wilhelm Voss, well, he worked for Omnipol, the international arms dealer, but I'm sure that was just a coincidence. But what of all this secret Project Riese sites? In order to try to piece together what happened in Lower Silesia, an area occupied by the Russians after the war, where, after they initially evacuated everybody who used to live there, so we do not know what they retrieved. Let's follow the documents here. One letter is initially interesting. This letter is from Dr. Kammler to SS Dr. Brandt, SS main office. In his letter, Kammler refers to a recent meeting they all had at Wiebelsberg, referring to an order given by Kammler in regards to decentralization of various assets and departments. It also refers to scouting out secret special projects for the Ahnenerbe that had been carried out. However, all of these could not be carried out, important as they were, until after Sonderbauverhabe S3 could be completed or after the war had ended. So let's see, what were these special building projects? Following 3 documents from Albert Speer's ministry, document files in which Speer refers to a briefing given to Hitler on various weapons testing sites, status of iron, and an incomplete note on the needs to inform the British of something related to OT, Organisation Tod Workers? Still, I do not know what that means. However, further on the list is the S3 building construction project. It is especially listed key building projects of Riese and Lothar in conjunction with underground facilities under Fürstenstein, Schloss Castle. Igor Witkowski suspects that Ludwigsdorf is the location for where the mysterious facility named Lothar was placed in the center of where a lot of Riese construction was taking place. All the various Riese complexes was being built here. It was mentioned that only one block, Block 2 and sections A, B, D, G, had been carried out. The remaining systems would only be built afterwards, meaning that some parts of the complex would be moving into operation, so it could be operated from the 11th. They would continue to work at all speed. Despite how the Riese project sites looks incomplete, countless witnesses have testified after the war of seeing huge, complete underground facilities in operation. Besides the document pertaining to the Lothar plant, one of the most important Igor Witkowski had found was referring to a meeting of the AEG, working on a project classified as Charity-Anlage, not to be confused with the hospital in Berlin, working with Hochspannung, high voltage. It cites Dr. Schumann, and it's from 1942, and it is classified that this project was decisive for the war effort. Nowhere else have we ever seen such a designation. The French captured what appears to have been another, incomplete, Bell device, created by Swiss scientist Dalbach. Also, the Alsace team reached the Austrian town of Melk. They came across another nuclear project, which they termed Transformer Room. Dr. Wolf Wittruhe, whom after the war referred to the device known as an X-ray transformer, which also appeared to be the claimed Nazi bell. Now, we don't really know what the bell was. or what it did, or how many there were. Maybe it was components to other projects. The story of the bell was broken to the world by Igor Witkowski, Polish researcher and historian, in 1997. It seems clear that the bell is a technological part of a bigger technological picture. It was to be part of something more. He found the information about the bell reading from the war crimes testimony of SS General Victor Spornberg. Spornberg mentioned that he was evacuating a technological instrument about 9 feet tall, containing counter-rotating spheres, supposedly containing red mercury. It would spread large amounts of electricity and would spin at extreme speeds. It would emanate radioactivity and possibly had anti-gravitational abilities. It would emanate a humming sound, which could denote electrical switches opening and shutting very fast. But it would initially kill anything or anybody nearby due to its radiation. It was supposedly tested underground, and it has been claimed, made by post-slave workers from the nearby concentration camps, that they saw a blue light hovering over the near Ludwigslust complex, where the famous henge is located. And given the electrical infrastructure in that location, such experiments are certainly possible. They had the electricity to carry out high-voltage experiments at that location, and was pre-war ammunition factory, and there was rail links. So the infrastructure was there. And with a note from the AEG mentioning high-voltage projects and the charity Anlage, special projects sometimes morphs into several. Sometimes they change names. Certainly something interesting was going on here. This is the part of the story that gets murky. There's a lot of rumors, a lot of different testimony that is not verified. So all we can go by is the few documents, and when they come from Speer's ministry, or hand of Kammler himself, noting specific top-secret high-profile locations, I had to go see these sites for myself. After the war, a veil of secrecy lowered over anything that had to do with special German research. The nuclear bomb projects, the rocket projects, everything was classified, and Hans Kammler disappeared. But he's not the only one who disappeared. A very, very important person in the Third Reich would be Martin Bormann. He disappeared as well. It was claimed that he was killed in the street fighting trying to get out of Berlin after Hitler had killed himself. Now, Bormann was many things, but he was incredibly clever. He had a meeting arranged with all the top industrialists at Strasbourg in 1944, explaining to them how they all needed to expatriate all their assets, their patents, and prepare for the Fourth Reich, because the military Reich had been lost. Interestingly enough, we don't know if Kammler attended this meeting, but we do know that the day after, Strasbourg, a town of no military importance, was bombed by the Allies. Still, Martin Bormann disappeared. They found his body supposedly in the early 90s, and with insufficient DNA testing, did not bother proving anything to my satisfaction, not even against his living children, whereafter they dumped the body in the ocean. Then of course there was Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo. He would have been instrumental in providing security for the countless Kammler-Stab locations and research sites and all his secret research teams. He also disappeared. And Heinrich Himmler? The man who probably knew more than anybody else. Well, he was suicided. And I'm saying that in that way because I have every doubt that he killed himself. I read the transcripts of the British transporting him to the house where he supposedly killed himself. He was eating on the way, and he had already handed over his suicide capsule, making it impossible for him to hide it in his mouth. Himmler had come to negotiate, not knowing that Churchill had given secret orders for top SS and Nazi officials to be murdered upon recognition. And he was killed. He knew far too much. He was too much of a liability. So why would the same thing not happen to Kammler? After all, he had given up everything he had. He would just be a liability. It is possible he was killed or suicided or hidden in exile somewhere on a beach where he could drink pina coladas. But people who know too much tend to just disappear, one way or another.
People need to understand and learn from history, and they can't do that if you don't write it correctly or if you rewrite it. But what we're looking at in this series is something completely different, because we're dealing with technology that we don't know what is. It would take a lot of convincing for me to believe that there was a bell hovering around the henge in Ludwigsdorf. But when I then read some of the papers that has snuck out of the archives from AEG and the Decisive for the War effort, and I see Hitler being briefed on projects that no one has any idea what was, certainly the Germans were building something in preparation for some really advanced technology to move in. And some of it may have moved in already and just disappeared. Did it go to the archives? Did it get scattered through industry? Military-industrial complex? We hear that term thrown around a lot. Certainly, what I want to do is go to all these sites and get an idea, feel for myself, what could be here? What could this have become? I don't know what I'm looking for. I really don't. I'm not a scientist. But I know that something was there. And I know people were killed to protect these secrets. And I think it's something we need to figure out what was. Because if this is as advanced technology as it could be, is Wernher von Braun's first test stand. Down the road is Diebner's nuclear reactor. Over there is the Maginot Line and all its amazing forts. I'm visiting them all and I'm bringing them to you. So I really appreciate you like, follow, and share what I'm doing, trying to document all these important historical locations. And if you feel like you want to watch more pictures or documents that I use for these, go to lostbattlefields.com. And if you feel like helping me out with my travels, because gasoline and travel and airfare is expensive, my PayPal is there, protectionserviceint.com. You are more than welcome, but you don't have to. I appreciate all your support and all your help, and I love seeing these locations, and I love bringing them to you.